John Brzenk had spent the better part of 2 decades cementing himself as the most successful arm wrestler in history. From Petaluma to Tokyo, from the Harley pulls to countless super matches, his calm dominance made him the benchmark every other puller measured themselves against. But as the 2000s rolled on, a new wave of talent began rising on both sides of the ocean. Big personalities, unorthodox styles, and the promise of a sport trying to push into the mainstream. It was in this turbulent moment that John Brzenk found himself once again not fading, but entering what many still consider the absolute peak of his powers. This is part 4 of the series on the greatest arm wrestler of all time. If you haven't already, check out the earlier chapters and make sure to subscribe to the Arm Historian to follow John's story all the way through. In the mid-2000s, a documentary crew started following John Brzenk. Pulling John would premiere in 2009, but the camera work on which it was built was shot earlier, right in the middle of a fascinating era in the sport, and by extension, John's career. The film captures more than a biography. It's a snapshot of a time where the best in the game, John Brzenk, still competed regularly, but was suddenly in the crosshairs of younger, more hungry athletes. Among those rising stars were very different threats. Travis Bagent, loud, explosive, and a natural entertainer right from the USA. Alexey Voyevoda, the massive, athletic Russian who was sweeping open and super heavyweight fields in Europe. The film crew followed John as he stood in the middle of that storm, protected by decades of technique, but challenged by new power, size, and styles from around the world. At no time was this challenge more clear than when John had to face Alexey Voyevoda at the opens of the 2004 Zloty Tour Cup. Voyevoda had conquered a prime Travis Bagent in the super heavyweight finals of that tournament, while John had a hard-fought victory versus a young Taras Ivakin during his own weight class finals. The match between Brzenk and Voyevoda served as a conclusion to the Pulling John documentary and ended up being a decisive victory in favor of the Russian, proving that John was surely still extremely potent on the table, but not quite as invincible as fans thought at this point in time. 2005 is the year that often trips people up, and for good reason. The open category at Zloty Tour that year was won by Travis Bagent, while the plus 95 kg right-hand division was taken by Andrei Pushkar. In short, Travis took the open, John ended 4th in the plus 95 kg category, and Pushkar took 1st in that very same division. This was not a clean passing of the torch, so much as a clear sign that the field had become deeper and more complex, and John Brzenk was in dire need of adapting himself to that field. What is easy to miss in retellings is how John responded. Far from collapsing under the pressure of youth and size, he did indeed adapt. He worked on his speed, sharpened his hand control, and hunted the micro advantages in the setup, where the younger men sometimes relied on brute force. By 2006, his adjustments had paid off. In the same Polish crucible, the Zloty Tour, John went on a serious winning streak, taking class and open titles that year and demonstrating that experience and precision still beat raw power on the table. Parallel to the Zloty story, the Professional Arm Wrestling League super matches were another key battleground. These were the events where legends and prospects met one-on-one for money and pride, which was still quite a novel concept in those times. In November of 2006 at the PAL Arm Fight number 27 in Manchester, John Brzenk met Andrei Pushkar in a high-profile right-handed super match, in which John took the match 6-0 this time. That result was a statement. Brzenk could still dominate the youngest powerhouses when he brought his full arsenal, especially in a super match. In 2007, John's mastery became clearer still. In the PAL Arm Fight number 30, he beat Taras Ivakin 4-2, and across the PAL cards, he produced a string of wins over very different pullers, even veterans who fought with endurance, and also younger men who relied on blitz hits. The late 2000s read less like the last gasp of a champion and more like a second surgical summit in a career that refuses to be summarized by a single era. In total, John won every Zloty Tour Cup Open category between 2006 and 2009, beating out people like Denis Cyplenkov, Andrei Pushkar, Rustam Babayev, Taras Ivekin, and many more of the top elite. What's more is that when the Zloty Tour started implementing the left arm into their tournaments from 2007 onwards, John would start doing consistently well on that arm as well, taking multiple first place finishes in his own weight category, but also making top 4 in the open category each time. Put plainly, the decade following the 2000s is not the story of a legend slowing down. It is the story of a legend sharpening himself, of a man who, faced with bigger, younger, and faster foes, still learned to be stronger. He took losses, yes, but he also claimed heavyweight class and open titles, swept supermatch series when necessary, and proved that the old ways still contained new answers. Even as John Brzenk crossed oceans to face Europe's new heavyweights, he never abandoned the American circuit. The North American stage, including countless large tournaments and nationals, kept him sharp and kept him honest. In 2004 and the years that followed, John's presence at major North American events was unmistakable. He appeared as a top finisher in the USAA National Pro-Am tournaments, listed as the men's right overall champion in this period. A clear sign he was still the man, stateside, when the best assembled. The summer of 2005 is often misremembered in the heat of a legend. At the Mohegan Sun PAC World Championships, the detailed brackets show John taking the 198-pound right-hand division crown, while Travis Bagent won the 199-plus right-handed division. In short, both men were still quite dominant, but in different classes. That year's Mohegan Sun is one of the best examples of how the depth in North America had truly grown. Multiple elite pullers were taking titles on the same card, not always directly across from one another. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas and other US Pro events, John continued to collect major results. In April of 2006, he beat top opposition to win the Ultimate Armwrestling 3, a result flagged in the event listings and used by contemporary rankers as part of the case for his continued #1 status in that year. The American scene was clearly not a backwater. It was still a brutal, legitimate proving ground, and John was still handily winning tournaments left and right. Across 2005 to 2006, he faced and dispatched the top domestic names when they came for him. Those events weren't always showpieces, they were actually hard, practical fights against opponents who knew his game intimately by now, forcing John to ever adapt his style. By the late 2000s, Brzenk was balancing high-profile European trips with reliable domestic showings. He was a bridge for two very disparate parts of the sport. The man who legitimized both circuits, and that balance is a part of why his mid-2000s run reads as a second apex. He wasn't merely surviving the sport's evolution, he was helping steer it, proving that elite experience and surgical techniques still won when the pressure was real. By 2006, John Brzenk's life was a balancing act between the familiar and the ever-changing. He was still working full-time as an aircraft mechanic, same routine, the same modest garage setup for training, but the landscape of arm wrestling around him was shifting fast. Younger pullers were studying biomechanics, dedicating themselves full-time to the sport. John, in the meanwhile, still treated it like an extension of his life, rather than the actual center of it. Talking about training, Brzenk never pretended to be a gym rat. His strength came from decades of table time and the kind of tendon conditioning you can't replicate with weights alone. Even as the world around him obsessed over routines and recovery, John's formula stayed simple: consistency, experience, and most of all, a natural feel. In interviews from this period, he'd admit that he wasn't training as intensely as in the past, and yet his results kept him near the top of the ranking. To those who watched him closely, his pulling style had become even more refined. If he couldn't overpower you, he'd outposition you. At home, things were steady. John was raising a family, working long hours, but still finding the time to compete, often traveling halfway around the world to compete with the very best. It wasn't glamorous though, but it was part of his legend. He had become the quiet champion who never seemed to chase attention, only good matches and potential financial gain. Still, the sport was catching up. Europe had grown deeper, stronger, and more professional than ever before. John's trips to events like the Zloty Tour made this clear. This wasn't the 1990s anymore. He could still win, but he had to dig for it. And with each year, the recovery between events grew just a little slower as John grew older. By 2007, that reality was beginning to surface. John was dealing with lingering pain, elbows, wrists and shoulders, which had all endured more torque than most people could even imagine. He wasn't declining fast though, but the edges were beginning to fray. That's the version of John that would eventually walk into the Armoires event in Manchester. Not broken, not past his prime, but worn enough to make things interesting. Across from him stood Devon Larratt, a hungry Canadian 10 years younger, analytical, methodical, and ready to test himself against a man whose name had defined the sport for decades. It wasn't just any old super match, it was a collision between legacy and ambition, between a man who'd quietly ruled for 25 years and another who was just beginning to understand how high that mountain really was. The two had met quite a few times before though, and Devon had never been able to summit that very mountain called Brzenk. That day in September of 2008, Devon seemingly came in better than ever at Armoires though. In a shocking match that upset the entire arm wrestling community, Devon dominated John Brzenk 6-0 on the table, seemingly at times toying with the champion. The passing of the torch was complete, and apart from lauding Devon Larratt as the new best arm wrestler of the time, people were also quick to point out John must have been all but washed up.
Oh my word, look at Devon Larratt. He's posting, he is controlling the perfect storm. Unbelievable arm wrestling. Larratt is off the charts.
John would not hold back when speaking about the match afterwards though, heavily criticizing the refereeing of the match and the fact that Devon seemingly got away with setup shenanigans, hinting at a potential different outcome if the match had adhered to his idea of fairness. In that same year though, John made a true statement that people should not count him out quite yet, participating in the Zloty Tour once again, and once again cleaning house. He even overcame a person many were seeing as the future of arm wrestling in the East, in the finals of the event, Denis Cyplenkov. It wasn't revenge against Devon, but it was a statement. He could still handle anyone, anywhere, when the table was arguably level, and the call was fair, in his mind of course. Over in North America, things weren't much different, with wins on both arms in the competitive Ruler of the Nation event, and wins in a whopping 5 different categories at the US Opens. During the late 2000s, he also got super match wins over the likes of Monster Michael Todd and Denis Cyplenkov. 2009 therefore was largely a repeat of the previous year, with John still showing extreme dominance in the biggest tournaments of the day, close to home in the West, as well as overseas at the Zloty Tour. It truly seemed John hadn't missed a beat, even after his loss versus Devon earlier. His dominance was even more surprising to onlookers when the documentary, Pulling John, finally released when the decade was nearing its end. In the film, John spoke about retiring and how he will be hanging up his strap and walking away from the arm wrestling world. Nothing seemed further from the truth though. He was no longer the champion of everything, but John Brzenk remained the ultimate gatekeeper, the benchmark every new puller secretly wanted to test themselves against. When younger athletes like Devon Larratt, Michael Todd and Travis Bagent began taking on global matches, John became the measuring stick at home. If you could beat John, you were world class. If you couldn't, you were potentially still very good, but had some work to do to dominate on the global scene. In the first half of the 2010s, John still remained more active on the global arm wrestling circuit than most, but clearly became less prolific in his matches. He dominated at the North American UAL League, which had become the go-to arm wrestling circuit for the top talent, and several high-stake tournaments over in Europe and throughout North America, including the Europa Super Show, the Jimmy Payne International, and yet another revival of the Over the Top tournament in 2014. Although his super match appearances were becoming more sporadic, John also beat Ryan Espy on the left in a super match in 2013, and he also won versus the South African champ Terence Opperman on the right arm in 2011. During this time, apart from winning a multitude of UAL titles, John also competed at the stacked Mike Gould Classic, Canada's top-tier tournament, and cleaned house there multiple times, even winning a right-handed super match over Matt Mask in 2015. There was a turning point though in 2014. The World Arm Wrestling League, or the WAL, had just launched a new TV-ready circuit, trying to turn arm wrestling into a polished American spectacle. Promised something that appealed to John: professional-grade setups, real prize money, and the chance to bring the sport back into mainstream visibility. Despite being well into his 50s now, John entered the tournament. The WAL format was faster, flashier, and more aggressive than the traditional circuits he'd spent his career mastering. But what followed would silence every skeptic who thought the legend's time had already passed. After winning the regional qualifiers in 2014 at Las Vegas and then the subsequent championships the year after, John found himself at the 2015 WAL Final Championships, competing for the heavyweight title on the right arm. At that WAL Championships, the brackets eventually set up a poetic semi-final: John Brzenk versus Devon Larratt. 7 years after his devastating loss at Arm Wars, and this time John made sure things would be different. Devon came in bigger, stronger, and with the reputation now of an immovable top roller and versatile all-around puller. But John was patient. He himself came in lean, and this time deeply familiar with Devon's setups. The opening rounds shocked the audience. John looked sharp, tight, and surgical, even outright beating Devon in a preliminary round in the tournament. Instead of chasing Devon's hand, he controlled it. Instead of forcing strength, he used precision. Round after round, John's mastery of timing and control shone through, beating Devon 2-1. When it was all over, the scoreline of the semi-finals told the story. John Brzenk had beaten Devon Larratt, and he even went on to easily beat Marcio Barboza in the actual finals of the tournament, reclaiming the symbolic top spot for the heavyweights in North America and proving that legends, true legends, never fade quietly. After the match, Devon was gracious, admitting John had been the better man that day, and later even reflecting that it was a necessary humbling for him as an athlete. For John, it wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. He had lost to Devon at a time when the world thought he was done. He had now returned, older and battle-scarred, to remind everyone that experience is still the best kind of power. The WAL victory marked the perfect narrative close to an era, the last great triumph of the old guard before the sport would splinter into different leagues, YouTube channels, social media, and promotional wars, relying heavily on semi-fabricated beef between different athletes. And quite fittingly, it was John Brzenk who stood in the middle of that transition once again. He was not only the bridge between continents, but now the bridge between generations. The man whose story never really ends, but only evolves. Indeed, if you want to follow the continuation of that evolution and see John Brzenk make one of the most highly anticipated comebacks ever at such an advanced age, be sure to subscribe and tune in next time for the final part of this John Brzenk miniseries. Arm Historian, out.